So, welcome everyone. We're going to begin with a land acknowledgement, and then we'll go into a larger welcome. So, coming from many areas across Long Island, we recognize that land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on. We honor the Indigenous people who have been living and working with the land from time immemorial. We recognize the unique and disproportionate hardships Native Americans have faced and continue to face as a result of colonialism. We acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and unceded land, the traditional territories of the 13 communities that existed on Salonica, what we now call Long Island, before European settlers arrived. The Canarsie, Rockaways, Merricks, Massapequas, Matinacocks, Nissacops, Porchogs, Secatogs, Onkchogs, Shinnecock, Montaukett, and the Manhasset. May their spirit be with us.
Thank you, Susan. And I think some of us had the opportunity this weekend to experience the powwow here on Long Island. And so many of those Indigenous groups were represented here and celebrating together. So it was good to be with them and good to be among all of them. So we start today by saying welcome to all of you on behalf of the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project. I'd like to welcome Brenna and Glada, who will be with us today. Brenna has been working very closely with the Sisters of St. Joseph, along with 7 other congregations on this Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Team project. So I just want to tell you a little bit, just 2 minutes of a little introduction to the project. Susan Wilcox, who you just met, Joan Gallagher and I have been representing the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood as a team, working together with other cohorts from other religious congregations. And we've been working together for the past year. We look forward to continuing this cohort relationship. And the project has really been an opportunity for religious communities to come together regarding land justice, to build land justice together into the heart of our plans as we move forward. So we had the opportunity over the past year to have some educational opportunities, some partnership opportunity for research, some technical support came at various times. And but most important, we had an opportunity to go away for a few days together to really learn, grow, and celebrate with other religious congregations. So each of these 7 congregations had a team, and the team was anywhere from 3 to 5 people. We all came together to celebrate some of our victories, some of the things that have gone well for us in land justice, but also what do we need to be doing together. And we have this wonderful group, the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Team, that have really been leading us through this. So we're grateful for this opportunity today. This is a little bit of a teaser for an upcoming retreat that will be a 2-day in-person retreat in October. And that opportunity will give us time to probably get more information, delve further into this, but work together on this project. So I welcome Brenna to be with us today. And before we start with Brenna, Joan is going to lead us through a prayer and a ritual. But thank you all for being here.
Great. Thank you, Karen and Susan, and thank you all for being with us. And just to focus us for this session, we just have a little prayer, some words of wisdom from Robin Wall Kimmerer from the Potawatomi Nation, and some of you might know her through braiding sweetgrass. A source of belonging or belongings. Two worldviews met on this continent. Worldviews which color our relations with the living land, which shape our answer to the question, what does land mean?
A worldview in which land is understood as sacred, as our sustainer, our pharmacy, our identity, our home, our library. The place where we play out our moral responsibility in return for our very lives, peopled with our non-human relatives. This is a way of being in which the tar sands are unthinkable.
The view of the earth suddenly encountered another view, a kind of climate change in values. The whole notion of land as a set of relationships and moral responsibilities was replaced by the notion of land as rights, rights to land as property.
What our people called the gifts of the land suddenly became natural resources, ecosystem services, and capital. Nature as family became nature as machine, and our non-human relatives, or teachers, became mere objects for consumption. This is a way of being that invites us to the tar sands.
This is the same question that has us teetering on the precipice of unparalleled extinction and climate chaos. Is the land a source of belongings or a source of belonging?
There comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness. That time is now. Wangari Maathai. Thank you so much, Joan, for that prayer, Karen, for that welcome, and Susan, for that beautiful land acknowledgement. It's a privilege to be with all of you here today. Thank you to everybody here for joining, for showing up to learn about and talk about land justice, to talk about the ways the doctrine of discovery has impacted our private property system, and to begin to imagine some of the creative and transformative ways we can act to heal that legacy. I'm going to share my screen as well. I'm going to ask if you can't see something or hear something, please come off mute and let me know, because I don't think I'll be able to see the chat with multiple screens open. So as you heard, my name is Brenna Cussin Anglada. And I work, along with being a member of the Catholic Worker Movement, I work with the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project. And the goal of the Land Justice Project, as Sister Karen mentioned, in collaboration with movement partners and women religious, is to create land transitions that are rooted in racial and ecological healing. And also, as Sister Karen said, through our Focus Community program, we've been working closely with 7 communities of women religious, including CSJ Brentwood, to assist them in incorporating land justice into their property planning process. Yesterday, we actually just opened the application process to invite in 7 to 10 more communities into the cohort, and I'll talk more about that at the end of today. So what do I mean by land justice? We define land justice as the practice of centering racial and ecological justice in decisions about how land is loved, used, and governed by people. Practically, how do we do that? Well, there are 3 interwoven components of land justice. 1, protecting land from extractive development. 2, regenerating the health of land and waters. And 3, shifting equity and control of land to communities who've been systematically dispossessed of land in this country, especially Black and Indigenous communities. So my hope today is that we're going to all come away with a much better understanding about the roots of land injustice so that we can talk about what land justice looks like and how those roots intersect with the climate crisis and racial disparities that exist today, as well as the huge role that the church has played in those roots. But also, I hope that this time allows all of us the opportunity to begin imagining ways we might implement land justice in our own context, leading toward greater racial and ecological healing. So I'm going to start by sharing just a little bit of background about how the Land Justice Project came to be. Many of you are already likely familiar with Nuns and Nuns, which first started in 2016 as a place of encounter between women religious and community-oriented activists of various spiritual backgrounds, many of whom didn't claim a single religious affiliation, earning the nickname Nuns, as in none of the above. And so dialogues that were centered on the shared interests of justice, spiritual formation, and community began taking place all over the country. And as these encounters were unfolding, our nation was beginning to more intensively face the intertwined crises of climate collapse and racial injustice. And at the same time, communities of women religious were beginning to move through the experience of their communities growing smaller and needing to make tough decisions about land and property. So this Nuns and Nuns community of encounter began asking in a more serious way, given the ecological and racial healing that is so desperately needed in our time, what then shall we do together as the nuns and the nuns? What shall we do together? So with steadfast encouragement of sisters and movement partners, the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project was born in just 2021. We're a pretty new project with the purpose of supporting religious communities to incorporate land justice into their property planning. And there are a few of the members of the Racine Dominican community there at our May gathering. In the first 2 years of this work, we have only become more affirmed in our belief that land is the key to both racial and ecological healing in this country. Who owns land, who governs land, how we treat land. It's through the decisions that we make about land today that we believe that we can create a livable future for all of us. As a society, it's clear that we desperately need land to be in the hands of regenerative, just, and visionary stewards. But one of the biggest barriers today to this happening, one of the biggest barriers to creative climate and racial justice initiatives is the lack of access to land for these creative, visionary stewards. And so our belief, our thesis is that we believe if current property owners, many of whom today are white Christians, were to center land justice in their decisions about what their property, what's going to happen to their property in the future, we could bring forth a powerful transformation in our society because we'd be able to tell a new story of what could be possible. But in order to tell this new story, let's dive a little bit more deeply into the old story that we've been living in, the story of land injustice, and take a little dive into how we got to where we are today. So for the last 500 years, when it comes to land and property, this has been our story. This is one of the three 15th century papal bulls that make up the doctrine of discovery. I'm sure many of you have been talking about this. Through these bulls, the church declared that any land that was not inhabited and ruled by Christians was available to be, quote, discovered and claimed outright for European nations. And it was these bulls that acted eventually as the legal, political, moral, and spiritual justification for some of the most heinous projects over the next 5 centuries. The genocide of indigenous peoples, the theft of indigenous lands, even the transatlantic slave trade. And by 1914, the colonization of 84% of land on Earth by European nations and descendants. As many of you are probably aware, the Vatican recently repudiated this doctrine, stating that the ideas in the doctrine are antithetical to Catholic teaching. But it's really important to clarify that this announcement from the Vatican did not put resources toward making amends or reparations for the damage that the doctrine has caused over the last 500 years. It's also important to note that the doctrine of discovery is not only still an active legal doctrine in the United States, it's actually the foundation of modern property law in this country. 200 years ago this year, in 1823, in a case called Johnson versus McIntosh, the Supreme Court enshrined these papal bulls into US law, citing that, quote, discovery is the foundation of title, and this overlooks all proprietary rights in the natives, end quote. Johnson versus McIntosh is one of the first cases that new lawyers learn in law school. It's considered one of the bedrock cases in US property law to this day. And it was cited as the doctrine of discovery was cited in the Supreme Court as recently as 2005 in a majority opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in a case that ruled against the Oneida people who were trying to recover their stolen land in what is now upstate New York. So this is really recent history. Many of you will recognize this image from school history books. We talk about the doctrine being some of the spiritual justification. This image depicts the idea of manifest destiny, or the westward expansion of white settlers into what is now the United States. Notice that as the angel and the white farmers are moving in, the native people and the buffalo at the left side of the screen are fleeing, almost disappearing off the page. White settlers believed that they had the right to kick people off their land, to destroy their way of life, and to take whatever they found. And this belief was and is rooted in the doctrine of discovery. The same story we can see through another image as well. This picture is of a place you'll likely recognize and likely know by the name of Mount Rushmore. However, this place, which is located in the Black Hills, has a much older name, Haisapa. It's one of the most sacred grounds for the Osheti-Sakowin people. It's their emergence point, akin to the Christian Garden of Eden. But led by the US Army and the greed of gold mining interests, white colonists stole these sacred hills, knowingly breaking a treaty in which the US had agreed to never touch the hills. And then into that sacred stone, US settlers carved the faces of 4 of their white leaders, each of whom had participated in genocide against Indigenous people. This picture is an apt metaphor for how we got to where we are today. That through land theft and cultural domination, 98% of private rural land in the United States is now owned or controlled by white people, rather than by Indigenous people, who up until recently had communally stewarded this land since time immemorial. So to review this land story here, it was through the doctrine of discovery that Indigenous lands were stolen. And then they were allotted into parcels and then given or sold by white colonial governments to white people. And there's a whole lot of history we could get into about the particulars of how this happened. Indian agents, the Homestead Act, the Dawes Act, the Indian Removal Act, all of the legalities of how this happened. But for now, the simple statement will stand that land was fraudulently taken from Indigenous peoples by the US government and then given freely or sold cheaply to white settlers, and continued to be passed down and sold as private property, enforced and policed by the state. We see these hard boundaries in fences, barbed wire, and no trespassing signs. And then once these grids of private property were created, the state and settlers adopted this funny idea of fair market value. And yet fair market just means that the people with the most money, the most power, or the most influence, not necessarily the people with the deepest relationships with land, as we heard in the prayer this morning by Robin Wall Kimmerer, it is the people with the most power or the most influence who get to decide what happens to land. And as will likely surprise nobody here in our current society, the highest bidder is very likely to be white. Because today, the median white family in the US has a net wealth of $147,000, while the median Black family has a net wealth of $3,500. The average Native household has 8 cents for every dollar of wealth that the average white household has. And such a wealth gap, again, comes from an accumulation. We could get into the history, but we won't. The accumulation of many racist policies that have harmed the communities of color while benefiting white communities. And so again, the results of this, stealing the land, dividing it into parcels, selling it to the highest bidder, is that today, 98% of private rural land and 95% of urban land is controlled and owned by white people or white institutions. I am a landowner myself with 5 others, all of us white, in a St. Isidore Catholic Worker Farm. We communally steward 25 acres in Southwest Wisconsin. And as landowners within this private property system, we're given the right to lease land, occupy land, sell land, develop land, and we're even given the right as landowners to destroy land. This is the system that we've inherited. And it's with a system like this, it's no wonder that we are where we are today. Last April, we at the Land Justice Project hosted a conversation with 4 Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous leaders about the Vatican's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. In that conversation, Danae Elder, Pat McCabe, who was present with us at our May gathering, put it simply, the doctrine wasn't just a moral or ethical imposition. It was the beginning, the destruction of this Mother Earth in her entirety. And that project of destruction is well underway. Because since those papal bulls were written 500 years ago, we have lost in this country 90 to 95% of old growth forest, 99% of prairie, a third of our topsoil, and land is continuing to be developed at a rate of 1,500 acres a day. From the Willow oil drilling in Alaska to Enbridge oil pipelines in the Midwest, our elected officials, banks, and businesses continue to profit from such destruction. Again, all of this has happened during the centuries and decades when land has been in the overwhelming control of white settlers and the state, 98% of it. So we have to ask the question, what kind of society has the doctrine of discovery created in us and through us? So that's why we believe that to turn the tide in this society, it's time to ask, who is going to steward this land into the future? And we need to ask that question from a lens of racial and ecological healing. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes that when Indigenous peoples remain on their land, they themselves care for it best. He implores Catholics to build relationships with Indigenous peoples as the primary dialogue partners when it comes to care for the earth. And this is an image here from the Dakota Land Recovery Project, which is a group of Dakota who are trying to reclaim by purchasing land in Minnesota from where they were ethnically cleansed from in the 1860s. They're trying to return and build villages, eco-villages. Science backs the assertions that Pope Francis said when Indigenous peoples remain on their land, they care for it best. Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the world's population, and yet they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. So this is one of the reasons why climate justice movements are becoming more and more awake to the need for returning land to Indigenous communities. So I'm going to wrap up here before we have a little time for small group conversation. It's clear that racism and colonization, it's clear to us, and I hope it's also becoming clear to you, that racism and colonization are at the root of our climate crisis, and that the church bears a significant responsibility for this project of colonization that's gotten us here. And so even though the Pope and the Vatican has publicly rejected the statements made in these papal bulls, the damage has been done. And so it's not enough to just say, sorry, we were wrong. That's antithetical to Catholic teaching. Because while apologies are definitely necessary, when they're alone, they're not enough. Sarah Augustine, who's a Pueblo minister from New Mexico and a friend of ours, she's a leader in the Mennonite Church. She says that the doctrine of discovery, what was done in the name of Christ, must be undone in the name of Christ. And we at the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project believe that the legacy of the doctrine of discovery can be undone, that it's going to take all of us. As Catholics, if we want to engage in the work of healing and repairing both ecological and racial relationships, then we believe we need to work to undo the damage to both land and people. Soon after writing Laudato Si, Pope Francis said, we're not living in an era of change, but in a change of era. After hundreds of years of the racial harm and ecological destruction that's been brought about by the doctrine of discovery, today we're witnessing a growing movement to address these harms, a movement to engage with the world from a completely different paradigm. By participating in land justice as Christians, by taking responsibility for this legacy and joining the movements who are mending it, we can contribute to this change. And we at the Land Justice Project believe it's you, women religious in the United States, who are going to lead the way for us. We really have a lot of hope in you. That's why we're putting all of our eggs in this basket. All right. This is my favorite part. I love getting to share about some practical examples. So before we start, I just want to stress that, that there is no one way to practice land justice. We're going to be figuring this out together. So as we attempt to make our way up what we like to call the land justice mountain, our paths toward land justice are going to look a little bit like this. Every community is going to have a different context for what land justice looks like and how land justice would work best in your area. So I'm going to offer you a number of different examples. And as I'm sharing those examples, I really invite you to be looking for ways or clues that might make sense for your own community to move forward on this journey. Okay, story number one. You may recognize this as Stony Point Church, not too far away from you in the lower Hudson Valley. It was a Presbyterian church that by about 5 years ago had dwindled to about a dozen participating members. And so the presbytery made the hard decision to close the church and absorb the members into a neighboring church. The church congregants, who were inspired by the Presbyterian church's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery in 2019, had begun building relationships with the Ramapo Lenape Nation, who are the original inhabitants of that land. And it was because of those relationships that instead of selling the church, the members decided to give the church and the land surrounding the church to the Ramapo Lenape. And together, they created the Sweetwater Cultural Center. Here we can see a photo of the signing of the transfer of the deed to the church, with the leader of the presbytery, along with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Nation. And here's another image of the ceremony after the signing. And here's a picture of Sweetwater Cultural Center, which was created as a space of hospitality, cultural practice, and ceremony for Indigenous people, not only in the region, but around the world. Because as many of you are aware, the headquarters for the UN is located in New York City. And Indigenous people come to the UN headquarters from all over the world to represent their nations and defend their land. And they can often arrive in a very stressful urban setting, New York City. So now they have a welcoming space to go where they can rest and resource themselves spiritually in order to continue that global struggle for Indigenous sovereignty. So this story of Stony Point becoming Sweetwater Cultural Center is a great example of a direct transfer of title, which is perhaps at the strongest end of the spectrum for land justice, because transferring a title directly over to a Black or Indigenous community or another community of color fully shifts the power, equity, and control. And in this particular case, the deed to the land was a gift to the Ramapo Lenape Nation at no cost. But a donation is not the only way to transfer title or to do land justice. And we've actually learned that in some cases, communities of color would prefer the clear autonomy and clean break that comes with them purchasing land rather than receive a gift that sometimes comes with more strings attached. So this was the case in this next example of the Root Springs Collective, which is formerly known as Clare's Well, which is a retreat ministry of the Franciscan Sisters of Little Falls, Minnesota, or was a retreat ministry. So for almost 30 years, as Clare's Well, the Franciscan Sisters, after almost 30 years, as Clare's Well, the Franciscan Sisters sold their property when they were getting older and could no longer do the ministry, sold their property to a white couple, Joan and Dan Polly Schneider, who were really interested in spirituality and ecological and social justice. And in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020, Joan Polly Schneider particularly wanted to find new Black stewards for this land, for this special sacred piece of land. She wanted to ensure that the land just didn't automatically remain in white hands, which would be very easy to do in rural Minnesota. However, the Polly Schneiders couldn't afford to just donate the land that they had bought from the sisters. So Joan reached out to 5 Black women in Minneapolis who were all activists doing amazing things. One of those women, Zoe Holloman, had been dreaming about having a retreat space where Black activists could find rest and solace and rejuvenation. And so in the winter of 2021, Zoe and 5 others formed a cooperative and started fundraising. And over the course of several months, and with the cooperation of the Polly Schneiders, they raised, I think it's over $2 million to buy the land and start their project. So though the Polly Schneiders sold the land, they didn't give it as a gift. They specifically sought out Black stewards to be the next owners of the land, and they enabled them the time and space for the creative collective to be able to figure out ways to raise the money they needed to purchase the land. So this is also a really great example of land justice. Okay, the next example I'm going to share is of the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons. This is Callie Walker. She is a Methodist minister in Virginia, and that picture on the left is her family's 100-acre farm that she inherited several years ago from her father. One day, Callie went to an organic farming conference where she heard a presentation by this man, Duran Chavis, who is a farmer and a food activist in the nearby city of Richmond, Virginia. And Callie learned about the history of Black land dispossession in the United States. She learned that over the last 100 years, Black farmers went from owning 14% of all farmland in the country to less than 1% today because of campaigns of racial terror, as well as racist USDA loan practices, etc. Well, Duran was and is still trying to reclaim the Black community's relationship with land and access to healthy foods in and around the Richmond area. And in hearing Duran's story and learning of his work, Callie realized that this was the community dream she was meant to serve. So Callie donated her farm to a really special kind of land trust called an agrarian commons, which is designed specifically to protect long-term farmland tenure for farmers. So Callie's family land is now part of a network of properties in and around the Richmond area, from small urban plots to large-scale farms, all of which are run by Black farmers. So now Callie's family land is supporting a thriving, creative type of commonly held land stewardship, which is called the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons. It's one of 13 agrarian commons in the United States today, and this model, which is a new model, is rapidly growing. And I want to point out the unique way that Callie did this donation. While she and her husband flat out donated 90 acres of the property to Duran and the Agrarian Commons, she reserved the right for she and her husband to live on the other 10 acres until they die, until they pass away, through what is called a life estate. So this means that Callie gets to live out her days on her own family's land, right alongside this amazing land justice project that she donated the land to. So she loves to say, I'm trading my land for the best neighbors in the world. So this story, Callie's story, shows the kind of ecological and racial healing that can happen when those who hold power and ownership trust in the leadership and vision of those who've been traditionally denied such agency. Okay, 2 more examples. Here's example number 4, cultural use easements. This here is Clalting. It's an original village site of the Tsininkwe Nation in California. The land is a sacred site. Prior to removal, the Tsininkwe people held all of their ceremonies on this land. But due to the long story of colonization, some of which we heard about before the small groups, the land eventually came into the private ownership of a white person. This current white landowner, though, thankfully, is interested in being in right relationship with the indigenous nation of the land. And so he asked the Tsininkwe what they wanted to be done with the land. In this case, the tribal nation doesn't actually have the capacity at this time to own the land or to be the primary managers of the land, at least not right now. but they still do want to be able to access this land for sacred ceremony. And they want that access to be permanent and legally protected. Because as you may know, while the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1978, making it technically no longer illegal for Indigenous people to practice their religion and ceremonial practices. It was illegal until 1978. In actual practice, American Indian religion continues to be illegal because of trespass law. For the most part in this country, tribal members aren't allowed to access their sacred sites or traditional sites for ceremony because most of that land is now privately owned by white people. And though this particular landowner in this case was willing to grant access to the land to the Tsiningwe tribe for their ceremonies, there wasn't anything guaranteeing that when the land changed hands through either a sale or through inheritance, that the next landowners would do the same. And so in cooperation with the Tsiningwe Nation, this landowner created something legal, a legal document called a cultural use easement. You're likely familiar with what a conservation easement is, in which a landowner gives another entity, usually a land trust or a conservancy, the right to protect that land from any future development and enforce conservation goals forever. Conservation easements are forever enforced. So even if a landowner sells the land to a new landowner, the right to protect the land go along with that land. They stay in place. So the same is true for cultural use easements, except that the rights are slightly different. With a cultural use easement, a tribal nation or tribal members are given the right to access the land to gather medicinal plants, practice ceremony, or any other cultural or educational practices that are agreed on by the two parties. And those rights, again, are protected in perpetuity. Cultural use easements protect Indigenous nations from having to face yet again the trauma of broken promises, and yet again the land being taken out from under them. And so now with this cultural use easement, this is a picture of the Tsiningwe people doing their coming of age ceremony for young women at their ancestral village site for the first time in 300 years. They got to do this ceremony knowing that they should be able to return to this sacred site and do this dance every year from now on without anyone being able to take that right away from them. Okay, last example. You might recognize these groups of people here. I love to lift up the steps toward land justice that your own CSJ community has been taking over the last few years. So this is a picture of the Shinnecock kelp farmers, who I'm guessing you all have heard about or even maybe met. So these are 6 women Indigenous to the area, now called Long Island. And their kelp farming project began because these women saw that the bays on Long Island, including Shinnecock Bay, were being polluted by the septic systems and golf courses of the billionaires who lived and vacationed there, causing huge algae blooms and dead zones. And for at least 10,000 years, the Shinnecock have grown kelp as a food source and as an ecological management system, because kelp filters nitrogen, which is what creates those algae blooms, and filters the nitrogen out of the water. So the Shinnecock wanted to reclaim their traditional practice in order to clean the waters, but their reservation, due to the history of colonization, again, is relegated to the marshiest part of the bay. And they needed better coastal access. And guess who has some at this star over here? You guessed it. The Sisters of St. Joseph in Brentwood, New York. Here's a picture of Joan right there. So your retreat center property is right there on Shinnecock Bay. And because some of you had been showing up to their protests for a few years, the Shinnecock already knew you sisters and had enough of a relationship with you sisters to ask for access to those waters. And so now together you have turned a building into a kelp hatchery, and the Shinnecock have been able to revive their 10,000-year-old practice. So we at the Land Justice Project love to say, quote Joan Gallagher, and saying, being in relationship with the Shinnecock in solidarity must be at the heart of who we are, because a future emerges from the relationships that we cultivate in the present. So making this commitment to a reparative relationship of solidarity like you have is a first and major, major step toward land justice. And now the question that remains is, will this relationship result in something like a cultural use easement, which will guarantee that the Shinnecock have access to that bay in perpetuity, no matter who owns the land in 50 or 100 years? Will this relationship result ever in an actual transfer of land or return of the land to its original stewards through Neamuk Land Trust or another similar entity? That kind of step is up to you all in your ongoing conversations with the Shinnecock. But know that you all at the CSJ community have been a model for how to create these conditions in which land justice can thrive. And so many communities out there have been inspired by the journey that you are on right now. And we're all really excited to see where this relationship leads. So again, in all of these stories, while we see that there's no one way to do land justice, we do see that all of the stories start with relationships of solidarity, as Sister Joan said. And in all of them, they end with extending trust and control. And in each of them, of course, love and joy is present. So again, 2 years into this work, as I said at the beginning, it's become very clear to us and increasingly clear to us. And we hope it's beginning to become clearer to you as well, just how key land is to both racial and ecological healing. Land holds our stories. Land is the site of our country's original sins. But land can also be a place of and vehicle for repair, a vehicle for hope, and a vehicle of the creation of a livable future, all of us.